conference, and they will discuss various security aspects in the conditions of the formation of a multipolar world order, as well as ways to reestablish constructive international interaction. And within the framework of aggressive claims of a group of Euro-Atlantic elites to claim the global dominance. In his remarks, Minister will focus on world's majority countries finding ways to develop outside of Western mechanisms, including by strengthening multilateral associations of a new type like SCO, BRICS, UA, EU, CSTO, CIS, and now moving to the relevant international issues. Let's talk about the Ukrainian crisis. The armed forces of the Russian Federation continue to successfully repel the attacks of Ukrainian armed units and gradually liberate new territories from neo-Nazis. Meanwhile, Western countries are turning a blind eye to numerous losses of Ukrainian troops and they demand from the Kiev regime to conduct pointless and suicidal counteroffensive. American media has recently published information citing Ukrainian sources that as of today, by different estimates, more than 400,000 Ukrainian soldiers considered dead. Without having an opportunity to demonstrate results on the battlefield, neo-Nazi Kiev regime continues to resort slavishly to terrorist methods of warfare against Russian residents by targeting civil facilities far from the front line. On the night of August 4th, armed forces of Ukraine tried to attack the port of Novorossiysk. On August 6th, they shelled the bridges connecting Crimea and Kherson region, and they continue their attempts to attack civilian objects in Moscow. In Moscow region, on August 6th, air defense forces have shot down a drone on the territory of the Podolsk district of the Moscow region, and on the night of the August 5th, the sea drone attacked the Russian civilian vessel near the Kerch Strait, and by a lucky chance, these actions haven't resulted in the ecological disaster of the Black Sea. All these attacks didn't have any military meaning, and they are of terrorist nature. All the crimes committed by the Ukrainian soldiers and Ukrainian nationalists and representatives of the Kiev regime are carefully recorded by the Russian law enforcement forces and agencies, and Ukrainian criminals will face inevitable punishment. So we advise them to think carefully about fighting for the criminal Kiev regime. Recently, we have made verdicts to Prylutsky, who fired a grenade launcher at the civilian in Severodonetsk, Mr. Penkovsky, who threw a grenade at the backyard of the private household in Lysychansk, result of which a woman was injured. Kolesnik, who injured a civilian in Popasna, Kozlov, who fired a flamethrower in the microbus. All of these criminals received long prison sentences. It is telling that the NATO countries are supporting the barbaric actions of the Kiev regime. They continue to supply weapons, to train Ukrainian soldiers, and to provide intelligence data in order to carry out missile and drone attacks against civilian facilities. In this context, we know the reckless decision of French authorities to send low-range cruise missile Scalp to Ukrainian neo-Nazis. This is a step that was deplored by many sensible French nationals. Moreover, according to CNN news agency, Pentagon has recently approved the delivery of Abrams tanks for Ukraine, and they are going to send 31 tanks, the old model M1A1. We noted the information published by Polish media about the increased radiology level in the west of Ukraine and east of Poland, and it was happened after the destruction of depleted uranium shells in the storage facility in Khmelnytsky. These shells were provided by the United Kingdom, and it is clear that the Western sponsors are ready to do everything that they can to achieve their goals, and they don't care about the level of threat to life and health of Ukrainians that their weapons are posing. And in this context, Poland asks for 1 billion euros from European Commission to establish infrastructure to export Ukrainian grains through the country, and we do not exclude that such considerable amount could be requested to recultivate lands contaminated by radionuclides. Without any interest, showing an interest in peace process, Western countries continue to promote the peace formula, and the countries of the global south understand that it was shown by the consultations on Ukrainian crisis that was hosted by Saudi Arabia on August 5th and 6th. It was initiated by the Kiev regime and the group of 7 countries. Since Russia does not take part in this format and its interests are not taken into account, such events has no value added. And we can see that the countries of Global South were in the minority because there were 15 out of them present at the meeting and 4 or 5 out of them were connected to the meeting by a video link. Therefore, 2/3 of the audience were made up by the Western countries who are masterminds of the Ukrainian crisis and suppliers of weapons to Kiev regime and who are contributing to the escalation. The collecting West demonstrates consumerist attitude towards Ukraine and its residents, which is shown by the fact that regular Ukrainians are used as the cannon fodder, and many Ukrainians who move to Western Europe are not working in their profession for which they are highly qualified, and the average monthly salary of Ukrainians working a full-time job is 1,000 euro less than the average salary of all people working in Germany. Overall, we see that Ukraine has become a leader in the illicit organ trade, which is contributed by a new liberal legislation in this area, and there is no doubt that the unprecedented level of corruption and lawlessness in Ukraine is conducive to such crimes. All of this that I've listed confirms that neo-Nazis in Kiev and their Western patrons have shown no regard for millions of Ukrainians wherever they are, and NATO is using Ukraine in order to make Russia suffer a strategic defeat, and the delivery of cluster munitions was deplored by the authorities of Laos. In particular, speaking on the 30th anniversary of the entry into force of the Convention on Cluster Munitions, the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Foreign Affairs, Mr. Komesit, made an appeal to countries to refrain from using, producing, transferring, and stockpiling such heinous weapons, and to join the convention, as well as to ramp up efforts to provide a substantive support to the countries hardest hit by cluster munitions. Such a position of the official Vientiane is no surprise. Laos is still experiencing the effects of barbaric massive U.S. bombings during the secret war of the United States in the Indochina. Between 1964 and 1973, Americans has carried out more than 580,000 air raids, and they dropped on the Lao territory more than 2 million tons of ordnances of different types, which exceeds the number of bombs that were used against Japan and Germany in the World War II. In the result, Laos has the SAD rating and is the most heavily bombed country in the world per capita. At the same time, in the bombings, the territory of Laos has actively been bombed by cluster munitions. So we're talking about 270 million submunitions. 80 million out of them have not exploded, and they're still in the underground. Over 50 years after the war ended in Indochina, because of the unexploded bombs in Laos, more than 30,000 people died and 20,000 people suffered serious injuries. Unexploded bombs hamper the economic development of Laos because 37% of Lao territory considered unsafe for residents and economic activity. Since there is a need to carry out expensive mine clearance operations, there is a high cost for building roads, schools, hospitals, and other infrastructural projects. It was supported, this statement was supported by the 6 former U.S. ambassadors in Laos who wrote an open letter to Joe Biden administration. They referred to the damage that they witnessed, that such munitions has done and continues to do to Laos, and they called the actions of Washington to send cluster munitions to Kiev as wrong and disappointing. It again demonstrates that the United States is using the policy of double standards, and instead of before taking such inhumane decision, Washington should have atoned for their sins and respond to their actions that resulted in the numerous victims and irreparable losses in Laos and other countries, as well as to show their concern about conducting humanitarian mine clearance operations in the states affected by their actions. Russia, in its turn, over the last 5 years, is regularly sending specialists of the International Mine Clearance Center of the Armed Forces of the Russian Federation, and they are sharing their experiences with the bomb disposal engineers, and they have disposed of bombs in several provinces of Laos. And now, speaking about the situation in Nigeria, we're concerned by the developments in the Republic of Niger, where on July 26, the president was ousted as a result of a military coup. We believe that it is extremely important to prevent the further escalation of tensions in Niger, and there is no alternative to settling the situation by reestablishing law and order and organizing the inclusive national dialogue. We see that state authorities are continuing to work normally under the establishment of the National Council to Protect the Homeland, which was established by the military. They started to form a new government, and we support the military efforts that are taken by the African community to help Niger to find a way out of the crisis. We proceed from the assumption that the intervention of forces of ECOWAS and the sovereign states won't help to achieve lasting peace in Niger and to stabilize the situation in the sub-region. In this context, we see the negative response of a whole range of neighboring countries, including Mali, Burkina Faso, Chad, Algeria, about this scenario. According to the Russian embassy in Mali, which is accredited to Niger, there are no incidents with the involvement of Russian nationals, and they're taking measures to ensure security, and we recommend Russian nationals to withdraw from visiting the Republic of Niger until the situation stabilizes. Now, going back to Europe, we noted another EU report on human rights and democracy in the world for the year 2022. We have to note that the document is compiled in the destructive line of Brussels to instrumentalize the human rights issue to achieve their political goals and to promote their selective approaches in this area. The European Union continues to shamelessly use the human rights issue for an open and outright intervention into domestic affairs of states who pursue an independent policy. At the same time, Brussels turns a blind eye to the long years degradation of the situations. They totally ignore the violations of Russian-speaking communities in the Baltic region. They ignore the systematic oppression of journalists, and they believe that it's totally normal. And they don't see the rampant Russophobia in EU member states after the start of the special military operation. We see the selective approach in the context of the human rights situation in Ukraine. They ignore flagrant human rights violation of the population that does not speak the Ukrainian language. The discriminatory law that was passed by the Ukrainian parliament on national minorities was called as a step to bring the Ukrainian legislation in compliance with the European standards and best practices. This is what European Union is trying to achieve, isn't it? And therefore, Ukraine continues to guarantee the freedom of religion and conviction as the European Union believes. Brussels justifies the oppression of the canonical Ukrainian Orthodox Church, and they are seeing these steps as to restrict the influence of Russia by using religious organizations. As for the situation of women and systematic violence against women and their oppression of rights, including reproductive ones, are not reflected in the report, but the European Union even commends its efforts in the report. They are talking about the vote of the European Union against the traditional resolution on countering the glorification of Nazism. We see this as a direct evidence that the West is going to take every step, even to justify accomplices to Nazism and tolerance to neo-Nazi steps of the Kiev regime. The human rights agenda is used by the European Union as a leverage And as a reward for those countries who are ready to do the European Union's bidding, and they show total disregard for the human rights. It has nothing to do with them. And recently, we received a notice that in the first half of October, under the North Macedonian representative in OSCE, the so-called Warsaw Conference on the Human Dimension, I'll remind you the history of the issue. The OSCE rules provide for the organization of the meeting on human dimension. This is the largest event in the area of human dimension of the organization, and all the decisions are taken by consensus. It had happened before, when in uneasy talks, states made to find mutually acceptable solutions on the content of the review conferences of the discussions. However, the previous year, the current presidency in OSCE, Poland, has taken an anti-Russian position, and it was shown by the fact that it refused to agree with the member states the topics of the review conference, and the situation has become even worse, that the Poland authorities couldn't, but it didn't want to provide the security guarantees for the Russian participants on their territory, and they have made even artificial obstacles to acquiring visas, and they made other obstacles. At the same time, they are ready to flagrantly violate all the OSCE rules. Also, Russia requested to change the venue in a neutral country that would be able to ensure the security conditions of all representatives of all the member states of the OSCE, and the Poland's presidency organized some kind of a Warsaw Conference on the human dimension, and they tried to represent it as a full-fledged review conference that is established by the OSCE rules. And this year we see the same picture. Northern Macedonia, who has assumed presidency in the OSCE, has circulated an invitation to the Warsaw Conference on the human dimension that they are planning to hold in the capital of Poland in October. And they, by organizing this event, they want to replace the consensual annual review conference on the human dimension. Warsaw does not giving any guarantees again as when it comes to security or visas. The largest executive authority of OSCE, ODIHR, is playing the role of the technical organizer of the forum, but it is doing the bidding of North Macedonia. It goes against the earlier consensual decisions taken by the OSCE, and we won't leave it without proper reaction. As last year, Russia officially boycotts the conference in Warsaw, and we hope that common sense will prevail and other states will follow our example.
Now I would like to speak about the situation in Pakistan and its former Prime Minister. On the 5th of August, former Pakistani Prime Minister, leader of the major opposition party, was arrested in his residence and placed in prison. And the court of Islamabad sentenced the politician to 3 years in prison, and we think that it is a domestic affair of Pakistan, and we hope that the elections to take part in Pakistan will take place in accordance with the Pakistani legislation, and we are ready to pursue cooperation with Pakistan regardless of who wins in accordance with the results of the elections. Now it's a tragic anniversary. On the 6th and 9th of August 1945, there were atomic strikes against Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And decades after the bombings, we can say that the total number of victims exceeded 450,000 people, and the aim, according to the politicians, was to force Japan to surrender. However, historical research directly speaks about something else. It was a demonstration of a unique destructive potential, with the help of which Washington expected to ensure its global dominance in the post-war world. And now the US balances on the fringe of direct military conflict with Russia. And Japan is also actively assisting the Americans in their dangerous game, threatening with nuclear weapons. And Japan and the Republic of Korea pursue the extended deterrence strategy, which implies the presence of US nuclear forces in the region. And another gift for this anniversary was the visit to the port of Busan of the US submarine missile carrier Kentucky. And each of such submarines carries 20 Trident II missiles, and they are much stronger than those dropped on Japanese cities in 1945. And the catastrophe might be greater than experienced 78 years ago. Now let us speak about more positive dates and congratulate our Bolivian date. They celebrated on the 6th of August. I hope that the Muscovites noticed the lighting of the buildings on Novi Arbat in the evening. And another significant date is the establishment of Russian-Bolivian diplomatic relations. Modern Bolivia is pursuing an independent course in domestic and foreign affairs and one of Russia's key and priority partners. We are united by our desire to build a just and democratic multipolar world. We share common approaches to global agenda, upholding sovereignty and rejection of any form of interference in internal affairs and neo-colonial practices. These ideas are based on the fundamental interests of the peoples of Russia and Bolivia. These relations are developing in the spirit of strategic partnership, and the relations are developing in many mutually beneficial spheres, from energy and high technology to agriculture and education. The flagship project is the construction of the Nuclear Research Center in El Alto, which assists in the fight against cancer. And in this area, we also transfer technology and knowledge and train specialized Bolivian specialists. And Russia and Bolivia are important partners for humanitarian and educational exchanges. One more detail of this significant date is a special postal envelope issued by J.C. Marker that will take its worthy place in the collections. The Republic of Ecuador also marks the day of its independence. The upheaval that erupted in Quito in 1809 was one of the first in Latin America. Our relationships are based on equality and mutual respect. We have ties in humanitarian and cultural spheres. Many young people from Ecuador receive higher education in Russia. We hope for further dialogue with Ecuador, including the UN Security Council, on the principles of respect for international law in the interests of building a more just and secure world order, free from neo-colonial and unilateral restrictive practices. We wish success and prosperity to the Ecuadorian people. It's also the anniversary of the Montevideo Treaty that initiated the Latin American Integration Association that united the 13 states from Mexico to Argentina. We wish success to this association, and we are interested in mutually beneficial cooperation with this institution, and we are ready to work out possible mechanisms for cooperation. In this context, we would like to emphasize that Russia stands for united and economically strong Latin America, which is one of the important foundations of the modern multipolar world. Now let us pass to questions. Dear colleagues, International Live, good afternoon. You have just mentioned the tragic date, the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki on the 26th of June. The UN Secretary General sent a special message regarding these tragic events. However, Guterres did not mention those who were guilty of that strike, and the Prime Minister of Japan also did not mention that. How can you comment on such historic amnesia? There is nothing new in those declarations. This is cynicism and refusal to accept the truth. So it's with regard to the events commemorating the victims of that callous act that had no military justification. And Tokyo continues its fake accusations with regard to Russia, trying to conceal the historic truth by mentioning the events in Ukraine. It can cause only denial, and the USSR was the only country who conveyed the truth about the consequences of those historic events, and the cinema coverage made on the ground back then. However, it was not made public, and these are the revanchist delusions of modern Tokyo, who are forgetting the death of hundreds of thousands of their compatriots in August 1945. News.ru. News.ru, are you with us? Yes, we're here. Good afternoon. Our questions. The first question, how could you comment on the statements by Antony Blinken that Washington resolved all the issues on the grain deal, but did not get any response from Moscow? Were any letters received from the White House? I think that those letters were sent to Ukraine, and it is still not mentioned. The real situation is not spoken about. The humanitarian corridor was used by Kiev regime for terrorist attacks against Sebastopol and Russian vessels, and they do not mention the blocking of Russian import and the illegal sanctions. Our position remains the same and has been repeatedly voiced. SWIFT for Russian banks, renewal of shipments of parts, establishment of logistics and insurance, and that will be in accordance with the declared humanitarian goals. The next question, is Moscow planning to hold talks with insurgents in Niger? As we know, Victoria Nuland held talks with the insurgents. Well, we do not we follow the situation in Niger. We have already spoken about that issue today, and it's not about the visit, but its practically useful consequences, and our Western colleagues are not always successful in that. And we, as we have already mentioned, think that we should not allow further escalation in Niger and should assist in the inclusive international dialogue. And the situation in general is calm, and the public institutions are operating, continue to operate. And we think that the African solution should be found to that problem. We support the African efforts to resolve the crisis. We think that the intervention is unlikely to assist to contribute to peace in Niger. And the next question regarding Yerevan declarations that they are not ready to conclude a peaceful treaty on any conditions. And the U.S. Press Secretary Mr. Miller noted that the peaceful agreement remains achievable. How could you react on those insinuations with regard to Russian mediatorship? We think that this process, its aim is quality agreements, final quality agreements, and the impetus was made, it was underlined that the preparation of Azerbaijani-Armenian peace agreement is underway, and Russia is cooperating in the preparation of these documents using diplomatic channels at all levels, and the foreign ministers are regularly meeting. There has recently been such a meeting, and it's not any conditions that the parties are willing to accept. So we stem from those facts. Thank you. Thank you. That's all for us. Newsweek, are you with us?
Being here. I have two questions. The first is on Russia's relationship with Lebanon and the political process there. We've noticed that Russia has held a series of meetings with presidential candidate Süleyman Frangieh in recent years and months. And my question is, does Russia view Mr. Frangieh as a positive candidate for the presidency? And does Russia view his potential candidacy and presidency as something that could be in the interests of Russia?
Да, спасибо за вопрос. Мы исходим из того, что...
Yes, thank you for the question. We believe that the election of the president is now a key issue for Lebanon, and it is key for political stability in that country. We hope that Lebanon will be able to overcome all the issues and with regard to ethnic confessional groups. We do not have any preferences on personalities. We do not intend to interfere in the domestic affairs of other states. With regard to the leader of Marad, we know him very well. He repeatedly visited Russia. Sergei Lavrov had a meeting with him, and as well as Mr. Bogdanov, Deputy Foreign Minister. We think that he is a worthy candidate for the presidency, but the decision belongs to the people of Lebanon, and we will respect their choice.
Question is on the situation in Niger. You mentioned that Russia is against intervention and at the same time supports African-led initiatives to solve the crisis. Given Russia's relationships with other countries in Africa, such as Burkina Faso and Mali, who have opposed this intervention as well, and the fact that some Western countries have supported this intervention already, is Russia prepared to take actions, and what sort of response would Russia have to any sort of military intervention in Niger that could destabilize West Africa? Thank you.
Ну, нашу общую позицию по этому вопросу и вообще по вопросу регулирования.
Our common position with regard to this issue has already been voiced. As we know, there will be another meeting of this Organization of Western Africa, and the decision has not yet been adopted, but we hope that the decision will be found within the framework of diplomatic settlement, and we stem from those ideas, and I have already mentioned our negative attitude to any forceful methods. Thank you. Anadolu Agency. Yes, hello. We also have a question with regard to Niger. An aide to the Ukrainian President Mr. Pedalag accused Russia of participation in coup d'etat in this country. You mean coup d'etat in Niger? Well, comments a little bit do not make much sense, because the Ukrainian politicians 100 times a day they change their declarations. And our Western partners who, without any basis, criticize Russia, and there is no substantive basis here, so it's just some empty declaration. Thank you, the Moscow Post. Yes, we have had 4 questions. 3 remain because you have already answered one of them in your conversations with our colleagues. The first of them is on the outcome of the peace summit in Saudi Arabia. The Ukrainian side noted they do not insist on the withdrawal of Russian troops from its territory. How could you interpret that position? And how do you assess this meeting itself? Well, you should address those who participated in that meeting in Jeddah, because Russia was not invited there. And they just promoted that ultimatum formula of peace of Zelensky and the return of Ukraine to the borders of 1991. And we have provided our estimations. On the 7th of August, there was a reply by Madam Zakharova. So there was the minority of the states of the so-called Global South. Many participated via video communication. However, we value the peace initiatives of the Global South countries, and we are ready for serious proposals, and we are ready to discuss serious proposals. Thank you. Next question. How do you estimate refusal to enter Russia to 5 Chinese citizens? So with regard to the refusal of entry for Chinese citizens in Astrakhan regions, the official notes was received by the Chinese side, and it was sent to border service of the Russian Federation, whose competency is the crossing of the state border. We do not have details now, but in general, the Russian-Chinese relations are on an unprecedentedly high level and the best in history, which allows to operatively resolve the issues in practical cooperation. And the tourist potential of the 2 countries is great, and we welcome the arrival of the citizens from that country. If, of course, they observe the legislation for the entry and departure and the stay of foreign citizens. So it's just very difficult to avoid such issues, but they're resolved in a friendly manner. It's obvious that the case that took place in Astrakhan is within the political context and will not influence the general condition of bilateral relations. And this noise is just beneficial for those who do not wish us well and who want to damage the friendship of Russia and China. And we intend to further deepen the practical cooperation. And the testimony is the telephone conversation on the 7th of August by Sergei Lavrov with his Chinese counterpart. Thank you very much.
Is the Russian ministry taking part in the drafting of the intergovernmental agreement with China on the draft of the new land grain corridor Russia-China, and how this agreement is going to help the export of the Russian grains to China? The issues of the Russia-China cooperation in the agriculture are regularly discussed in the bilateral contact at the highest levels, as well as in relevant formats of the interagency cooperation. And we are engaging in an active dialogue to supply Russian grain products to the Chinese market. In particular, we are going to establish one of the major elements of the new land grain corridor Russia-China, which is a terminal for the transporting grain in the Zabaikal region, which is included in the list of significant projects of the Intergovernmental Russia-China Commission on Investment Cooperation. In our joint communique that was adopted after the outcome of the regular meeting of heads of governments of Russia and China, we have repeatedly noted the importance of promoting cooperation in agriculture, expanding the scale and diversification of goods that are sent to the Russian export, and we are also having major cooperations to increase the export of wheat to China. It was they were achieved by the result of the visit of President Putin to China, February 2022. Can I ask our question too? Do you believe what was the real goal of the summit in Jeddah? If it was clear from the very beginning, there is no point to organize this event without inviting Russia. I have commented on that. We have taken into account about the consultations of the Ukrainian crisis that were organized in Jeddah, the initiative of the Kiev regime and the group of 7. It was hosted by the Saudi Arabia, and we believe that in line with the agreements, they're going to share their assessments, and we confirm our position with regard to the Zelensky peace formula that Ukraine and Western countries are trying to promote in this kind of meetings. None of the points of this plan are aimed at achieving peace through political diplomatic means, and this is just a pointless compilation of ultimatums to Russia. What was their goal? You better ask organizers of the consultations about that. Tverskaya 13, please. Hello. I have several questions. Ambassador of Sierra Leone, Mohamed Yungava, in his interview to Rio Novosti, has expressed his desire to reestablish the direct air traffic with Russia, believing that the white sand beaches in the Atlantic Ocean can be an alternative for tourist destination for Russians. Have you received any official request from the Sierra Leonean leadership? No, we haven't received any. And the second question, the American journalist Morris called Ukraine as the capital of children smuggling and surrogate motherhood. Do you have any information about it? Ukraine is one of the countries where commercial transnational surrogate motherhood is allowed. It means that couples outside Ukraine can order babies. 1,500 babies who are taken by foreign parents abroad. 90% of them are taken by foreign parents abroad. However, such legalized children's trafficking is just a tip of an iceberg. Last week, Ukraine has discovered a large-scale scheme to send babies abroad under the guise of surrogate motherhood. In June, on the Ukraine-Slovak border, a man was detained. He was buying children, and they were sold also for the purposes of illicit body organ trade. And he has carried out 3 successful deals. Illicit organ trading and children's trafficking have become quite a lucrative business in Ukraine in the conditions of hostilities, when governments are allowed to evacuate children and thousands of pupils of orphanages. This business has reached a substantive scale. The voice of the motherland. Voice of the motherland, are you there? Hello. Hello. We have 4 questions in total. The first, can Russia, as the successor of the Soviet Union, can raise the issue of the occupation of the Soviet Union by NATO troops after 1991, so the part of former Soviet republics? So our attitude towards actions of NATO, their actions since 1991 are well known. The Warsaw Bloc has ceased to exist. Despite the fact that NATO is the rudiment of the Cold War era, we cannot understand the point of this organization. Washington is resolved to add a new life to the alliance, and they're using the NATO to consolidate the collective West to contain Russia and China. You know that despite their promises not to ensure the eastward expansion of NATO towards Russia, the military bloc is pursuing the open door policy. They do not want to establish a common security area, and they're trying to draw new divisive lines. They want to ensure security for their countries. We have been trying to reverse the trend, and we offered to reach an agreement, but as you can see, Russian proposals haven't received positive feedback. And what about the occupation of a part of the Soviet Union? Can Russia raise this question and take this complaint with NATO? We have been making our complaints to NATO starting from 1991, and you're well aware of what we're doing since then, and why many lawyers are saying that the only borders that are established in law are the borders of the Soviet Union. To be honest, I am not aware about these statements made by lawyers. I think that's we're talking about political philosophy. Let's proceed from the idea that we have the Russian Constitution, which reflects all of these moments. We have the law on state borders. And officially, by law, Russian borders are identified by our legislation, by our acts, and the Constitution is the most important legal act. What can we do to change the military doctrine, and can the Russian Foreign Ministry serve as initiator of the process? The military doctrine, the current version of it, was adopted by the Russian President Putin in December 2014. It's a document of strategic planning, and it is updated with a certain period of time, and it can be changed if there are any changes in the military threats, if there are changes in the objectives of ensuring defense and security, as well as the conditions for development of the Russian Federation and the major areas of the state policy in ensuring security and military policy are defined by the Russian president, while the military doctrine is developed in line with the federal law on security of December 28, 2010, and the Security Council responsible for it. It's a long process, and the Russian Foreign Ministry is involved in it. However, it does not playing a definite role, so you should take your question with the Russian Defense Ministry. Thank you. And the last question. Nationals of Ukraine, Baltic countries, Armenia, and other countries, they are calling us, writing letters, sending video messages. Just the recent example, the Armenian journalists who worked in the pro-Russian mass media, they position themselves as patriots of a single motherland, and they are discriminated for their position. They are getting fired. They are facing discrimination. Can Russia show any support to them? Each situation is individual, and we have to address it in a case-by-case basis. If you have any specific information, please share it with us through the channels that you're well, we can send it to the Information and Press Department. We are going to look at it, and we will try to understand what we can do within our competence. Thank you very much. Thank you. If you have no questions, then this is the end of our briefing. Thank you for your attention, and see you next time. Thank you. Thank you.